Britain has fallen, and their economy is in ruins. The cost of living is now so high that people are resorting to stealing food to survive. Energy bills are rising so quickly that churches and libraries are opening their doors to people who can't afford to heat their homes. Hundreds of thousands of industrial workers and university staff are going on strike. And to top it all off, they can now be facing blackouts on really cold winter nights, just when people need heating the most. But the worst part is that everything that's happening in Britain right now is a forewarning, a preview of what's to come in America. Except in America, it would be at a much larger scale. Because everything that Britain has been going through, America is going through the exact same thing right now as we speak. But to understand why, we need to take a closer look at how the British crisis began in the first place. And it all started with Boris Johnson stepping down.
On July 7th, 2022, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson resigned. Over the 3 years he was Prime Minister, he was involved in a whole lot of scandals, like throwing parties in the middle of COVID lockdowns, or appointing a guy accused of sexual misconduct to Parliament. But the main reason Johnson was forced to resign was the absolute chaos of the British economy. By July 2022, inflation was at 10.1%, higher than it had been in the past 40 years. The pound was at an all-time low against the dollar, which meant imports were getting more expensive. GDP has been declining. Basically, his political career was in the drain, and everyone thought he wasn't the right guy to dig Britain out of the hole it was in. So after more than 59 senior government officials quit because they didn't have faith in his leadership anymore, Boris Johnson made the decision to call it quits and hand off the mess to someone else.
That Boris Johnson is likely to tender his resignation by the end of this day.
Breaking news overnight, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has resigned.
Now to breaking news, embattled UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is stepping down.
And that's where Liz Truss came in. The woman who said that she would come in and save the day. That she would single-handedly turn the economy around. That she would cut inflation in half, lower taxes, and return Britain to its glory days.
My tax cuts will decrease inflation.
But unfortunately for Liz, despite her best efforts, things were about to go from bad to much worse. Liz Truss based her entire campaign to become Prime Minister of Britain on two things: tax cuts, major tax cuts. In fact, tax cuts so big that the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies said that, quote, "it's half a century since we've seen tax cuts announced on this scale," end quote. And on top of the tax cuts, she would put a cap on energy bills. According to her, these two moves would lower inflation and turn the economy around for good. There was just one small problem. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, stuff like fuel and food aren't as easy to supply as usual. So Britain was already struggling with too little supply to meet demand. But what did Liz Truss want to do? Cut taxes and cap energy bills, which would lead to more money floating around for people to spend, which creates more demand around an already dwindling supply of stuff, which would lead to more inflation. So her plan to lower inflation was probably gonna do the exact opposite. But that wasn't the only problem. See, her two little anti-inflation strategies were going to cost the British government more than $150 billion. But when they announced these plans to the world, they conveniently forgot to include how they planned on paying for all of it, which only meant two things: borrow and print. The UK government was gonna have to borrow and print more than $150 billion in the middle of an economic crisis and skyrocketing inflation. The market was not a fan of this plan. But despite the critics, despite all the hate, Liz Truss stuck to her guns and pushed forward.
I'm not going to cut the additional rate of tax today, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to abolish it altogether.
Are you absolutely committed to abolishing the 45 pence tax rate for the wealthiest people in the country?
Yes. We're hearing that Liz Truss is preparing to scrap plans to remove the 45p top rate of income tax for the highest earners.
Less than 24 hours ago, the Prime Minister told the BBC she was absolutely committed to that policy. Less than 24 hours ago, you were tweeting that it was a great thing. What changed?
We just talked to people, we listened to people, I get it. And we felt that the 45p issue, the 45p rate, was drowning out a strong package of intervention on energy, a strong package of intervention on tax cuts for people generally.
Do you owe people an apology?
We're not going to proceed with the abolition of the rate. We've listened to people. And yeah, there is humility and contrition in that.
Sadly, the market didn't share her optimism.